So welcome everybody. It's really great to see all of you and to have a chance to very briefly say a few words about Patrick. I'm going to, of course, let Mark Bowick do the formal introduction, but let me first talk a little bit about what's going on at the KITP. We are still actively doing all of our programming via Zoom. We had a great site visit from the National Science Foundation virtually 3 weeks ago, where we reported all the work we've been doing for the last year. And in 2020, we had 2,000 participants in KITP programs. So we actually doubled the number of scientists engaged at the Institute, though virtually rather than in person. So we've learned a lot, and we look forward to bringing those lessons learned to our reopening. Right now, we're shooting for our first possible in-person program in mid-July. And we'll see. We'll see if we can get there, but that's our planning basis right now. And of course, we can modify if need be, but we are thinking optimistically about the reopening of Cone Hall and are working hard to achieve it. So I will keep you all update on that. So it's really fun tonight to have Patrick, who's a long time good friend of mine, a personal family friend. I was introduced to Patrick very soon, both once he and I were at UC Santa Barbara due to a mutual friend who happens to be a writer at Physics Today. We knew Patrick well. And Patrick has a few notable elements of intersection with our family. I believe he learned to sail with my eldest daughter, who was upset that she had gone off to college, and then we all learned to sail. So when she came home for Christmas break, she drafted a gang of people to learn to sail together to bring down the cost. So Patrick joined that, and I think since then maybe it caught the bug. So it's really fun to have Patrick with us, and I really want to thank as well all of the KITP staff for making everything continue to happen, and of course all of you, the friends of KITP, for your support. It makes all the difference, and we really appreciate it. Our spring newsletter is well underway, so just to keep pressure on myself, I will say you should be getting a few weeks, and hopefully that doesn't panic Megan, but I think we're in good shape for getting the spring newsletter to all of you. So with no further ado, let me hand it over to Mark. Mark, of course, as you know, is our deputy director and really works to achieve this great outreach work of the Institute. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Lars. A good evening or wherever, whatever, to all of you. It's great to see everybody again. Lots of people, enthusiastic audience. The format tonight will be same as we've been doing for these kinds of events recently. So our guest and speaker, Patrick Mcrae, will give about 30 to 35 minutes talk. And then we'll have the Q&A where we'll switch off the recording. So there'll be no question will be embarrassingly recorded. I know you guys, you all ask lots of questions, so that is great. That's the way it will go. So I would just like to introduce our speaker, Patrick Mcrae. Unlike Lars, I haven't met him before. I just met him about 10 minutes ago, except I've been reading his book. And so I feel I know him a little bit through that book, which is fascinating. So Patrick is in the history department at UC Santa Barbara. I myself have historian colleagues, but I don't know any like Patrick. He's got a background in science, undergraduate degree, material science and engineering, and PhD from the University of Arizona. And then he's had a very interesting career studying the history of science and technology and interactions between technology and art and technology and so on. And his talk is going to be about this, making art work, this kind of interaction, which I think is great, and we see it all around us. Patrick has written 6 books, I believe, and one, The Visioneers, was a prize winner, won the Watson Davis Prize in 2014 from the History of Science Society as, get this, the best book written for a general audience. So congratulations for that. And I pass the floor over to you, Patrick.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me get this working there. All right, great. So yeah, thanks very much. I think this might be it's not the third, at least I know this is not the first talk I've given for folks with KITP. So it's always good to be back, even under the virtual circumstances that we're in. Yes, I have this new book out, and thank you very much for buying a copy and contributing in your modest way to my retirement fund. That's really good. The premise of the book is to look at interactions between artists and engineers and some scientists. I'll be saying more about that later on, from the 1960s to the present. So it looks at the ways in which these two different communities came together to work on big projects, to do major exhibitions, to do new publishing ventures and create new organizations. So starting in the 1960s, this was an era that juxtaposed Woodstock and moonwalks. And at first glance, you might think that avant-garde art and multi-billion-dollar programs to put people in the moon might not have much in common. Just two images, though, to sort of bring those things into conversation. On the left, we have the famous photograph Earthrise, taken on Christmas Eve, 1968, by NASA astronauts as they were orbiting the moon. And then on the right, maybe a little less common, a little less familiar, is the artwork by Robert Smithson called Spiral Jetty, located near Salt Lake City. If you ever get a chance and punch it into your GPS, you'll have quite an adventure finding it. But both of these things, these images, represent ways in which human creativity and problem solving came together. And both of these efforts offered us new and surprising perspectives on our planet and ourselves. So in this book that I just finished called Making Artwork, I wanted to explore the ways in which the histories of art and science and technology came together and spoke to one another. Or to put it differently, art is good to think with. It turns up the volume on some topics. It provides some fresh vantage points for seeing other topics anew. So in the book, I largely focus on the efforts of several different people who adopted different strategies to bring artists and technologists together. One of the characters I'll be talking about this evening with you all is an engineer by the name of Billy Klüver. For more than a decade, Clover promoted art and technology collaborations through an organization that he helped start called Experiments in Art and Technology. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But first, I kind of want to provide a bit of broader context. I wanted to sort of set out what was happening in the communities of engineers and artists and why they might have wanted to work with one another in the first place. So engineers, of course, had helped make the United States a prosperous and secure and materially comfortable nation. Engineers were the most common of white-collar professions for men in the 1960s, and the second most common for all people, the first, of course, being school teachers. Engineers also, as the illustration on the right suggests, were mass-produced at the time. So we can also think of larger stereotypes of the organization man or the man in the gray flannel suit, just sort of two images of engineers and people who worked for large corporations at that time. So while engineers had many signs of professional success, as a community, there was a growing sense of insecurity. Engineers were often criticized as servants of the military-industrial complex, and professionally, they often expressed concern about how they were seen status-wise vis-a-vis that of scientists, especially physicists. There were concerns about how they displayed their creativity and how to avoid the obsolescence of their technical skills. These critiques oftentimes spilled over into debates about how to best create, how to best educate the next generation of engineers. A lot of this discourse in the United States was informed by conversation that had already happened in the United Kingdom, most notably C.P. Snow's 1959 lecture and then book, The Two Cultures. The idea being that humanists and scientists existed with this gulf of mutual incomprehension between them. In the United States, this idea of the two cultures was something that informed a lot of reports that engineering educators produced throughout the 1950s and 1960s about how to humanize engineering, about how to expose engineers to more than just technical subjects. the idea emerged that the humanities, that the visual arts could help enhance engineers' reputations, to help them better understand the social and ethical implications of their work, and help make them more well-rounded citizens. So all throughout the 1960s, this idea of humanizing engineers via the arts was increasingly common at engineering schools. Now, artists were also experiencing the 1960s as a period of flux as well. The art world's center of gravity had already shifted from Paris to New York City as trends like abstract expressionism ran their course, and then new trends like pop art, minimalism, and conceptualism took their place in the art world's view. Painters also began to experiment with new media, for example, incorporating objects and sound and electric light into their works, producing what the artist Robert Rauschenberg called combines. But there were deeper changes afoot as well. We can think about how the ways or the communities of artists and engineers were similar. One point of similarity was the fact that it was increasingly common for artists as well as engineers to need professional degrees in order to function as professionals. So for an artist, it became increasingly common for them to get MFA degrees. Like science and technology, modern art was increasingly the subject of media celebration and scrutiny. Artists, in other words, became famous public figures, in part because of the money and growing celebrity that was associated with this. The funding structures for art in the United States changed dramatically throughout the 1960s. You see the emergence, for example, of the National Endowment for the Arts in the same year that you also get the National Academy of Engineering. In surveying these changes, the artist Alan Caprow, who was famous for creating a series of what he called happenings in New York City, noted that where once artists were in hell, they were now in business. In other words, the era of the lone, solitary, suffering artist was a stereotype, a relic of the past that didn't really accurately represent what artists did anymore. Caprow noted that artists were no longer tortured souls, but now they were members, respectable members even of middle-class society, preoccupied with things like getting life insurance, paying their medical bills, and sending their kids to college. Now, there were a few individuals who were capable of navigating both of these communities, and one of those people was Billy Klüver. Billy Klüver was born in 1927 in Monaco. He grew up in Sweden. As a teenager in the 40s and 50s, he was very much fascinated with Swedish experimental cinema. For those of you who like films, you know this was a golden era of film in Sweden, with directors like Ingmar Bergman achieving global renown. Klüver did his undergraduate degree in physics and electrical engineering in Stockholm, and then he migrates to the United States. He does his PhD work at Berkeley, where he gets his degree in 1954 in electrical engineering. And like many people with advanced degrees from elite schools, Klüver has his pick of jobs. He has offers to go to RCA, to go to Stanford, etc. But instead, he decides to go back to the East Coast of the United States, and he takes a position at Bell Laboratories. Bell Laboratories, of course, was arguably the world's most prestigious corporate research laboratory. It was a place of a generous corporate culture where engineers were not just able to do collaborations with people across a variety of disciplines, but indeed were encouraged to do that. And while he was at Bell Laboratories, Klüver, of course, had access to a wide range of technologies and experts. He literally found himself with one foot on both sides of C.P. Snow's two cultures, spending his weekdays working at his lab bench at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, and spending his evenings and weekends in lower Manhattan exploring artists' lofts, studios, galleries, and what have you. And he realized that he had a potential to do something that other people didn't. As he said in an interview in 2002, he had colors on his palette, as he put it, that nobody else in New York had, because he had access to all of the technological marvels available to people at Bell Laboratories. So Klüver embarks on a series of one-on-one personal collaborations with artists, working with people like Jasper Johns, Andy Warhol, dancers like Yvonne Rainer, the experimental composer John Cage. Here, for example, he's shown working with Robert Rauschenberg on a piece from the mid-1960s called Oracle. Klüver's contribution to this was to invent electrical devices that could wirelessly transmit audio signals from radios and other things kind of hidden within the various pieces of Rauschenberg's sculptural piece. The idea being that as you walked through the sculpture, it would sort of recreate the sense of walking down a Manhattan city street on a hot summer evening and hear the sounds of different transistor radios playing out the windows of different buildings as you were passing. But Klüver wanted to do more than just do these one-on-one sorts of collaborations. So in 1966, again, working with his colleagues at Bell Laboratories, he organizes a 9-day event called 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering. This was an important event for the art world. It was a very well-publicized social event in New York City, attended by something like 10,000 people over the course of those 9 evenings. Along with 10 different artists, more than 24 engineers from Bell Laboratories contributed their technical expertise to it, literally donating unpaid thousands of hours of time to help create the technologies that were necessary to make this work. The pieces that were performed were experimental, both in their conception, but also in terms of the technology that was involved. The audience expectations were primed, if you will, by a very enthusiastic and effective public relations campaign, with the audience members showing up in to see the shows at 9 Evenings expecting a sort of like techno-magical sort of event. They were somewhat disappointed, but we can think of 9 Evenings as this really true collaboration between artists and engineers as they work together for weeks on end, getting ready for their performances, and in the process, developing an appreciation how members from the other community thought about projects, how they thought about creativity, how they approach problem solving, literally working side by side to help put the devices together that were necessary in order to pull off 9 Evenings, extending all the way down to collaborating on making the hardware. One of my favorite illustrations from 9 Evenings is on the right there. This is the artist Alex Hay during his performance called Grass Field, where the brain signals are signals from his brain are being detected by a set of apparatus and are being then converted into sound, which is then sort of echoing throughout the performance space there. You can sort of see the electronics that he's wearing. One of the engineers asked about this afterward, said it was like preparing to put a person in space as they sort of basically wired him for sound before his performance. The response from artist critics, not as positive. Critics were generally hostile to 9 Evenings. As one New York Times critic concluded, "God bless American art, but God help American science. The Soviets are surely going to beat us to the moon." Engineers were mortified by these sort of reviews. You know, engineers, like scientists, they present their work at conferences, they present it in peer-reviewed publications and places like that, not exactly used to having their work dissected in public by art critics who oftentimes didn't understand the technology that they were writing about. Critics oftentimes focused on the aesthetic quality of the art, asking the fundamental question, is it even art? But as Klüver insisted, the novelty wasn't so much the product, but rather the collaborative process itself. These truly were meant as experiments in art and technology. And for those of you who are scientists, you know that sometimes experiments fail, and you can learn quite a bit from a failed experiment. After 9 Evenings, Klüver, working with 2 other artists, Robert Whitman and Robert Rauschenberg, and another engineer from Bell Laboratories, create the nonprofit organization Experiments in Art and Technology, which eventually grows to have some 4,000 members. In addition to doing a series of increasingly larger scale and ambitious projects, one of the primary focuses of E.A.T. was to connect artists with engineers and to sort of broker collaborations between members of those different communities. E.A.T. received prominent coverage throughout the late 1960s. These are just some examples of the literally hundreds of articles appearing in newspapers, newsletters, art magazines, engineering and physics magazines about this growing enthusiasm for bringing artists and technologists together. E.A.T. branched out from New York City, and some 24 local chapters formed throughout the United States. And we can sort of think of this as sort of a process of creating an infrastructure, if you will, that would foster these collaborations between artists and engineers and scientists. Now, what sort of technologies were artists interested in? Well, consider the laser, for example. The first optical laser was presented to the public in the early 1960s. It was a very different device than the sorts of things that we have around us today. You get some sense of the complexity of the device shown here in this advertisement from 1962. Lasers were delicate, expensive, complex, and finicky sorts of devices. They were a far cry from the sorts of things you can buy on Amazon and use to entertain your pets. But this advertisement asked this question: where does the laser go from here? Well, one place that lasers went to was artist studios and art galleries. Artists were some of the earliest adopters of this technology as they explored the possible aesthetic uses of it. So, for example, in 1968, the Washington, D.C. based artist Rockne Krebs began using lasers to create sculptural works. This is a piece shown entitled Sculpture Minus Object. It was done in collaboration with a research scientist from the University of Maryland, where Krebs used lasers and holes drilled in mirrors to create a seemingly endless beam of light that delineated a volume of space. Krebs' idea was that the laser beams would capture the three-dimensional volume of a traditional sculpture. The work, of course, was both minimalist and very ephemeral. In other words, once you turn the lasers off, what is left of the artwork? Now, these explorations of the laser's creative potential wasn't limited to just artists, and the art and technology movement included many scientists and engineers who also wanted to explore their artistic sides. So we might consider the experiences of Elsa Garmire, for example. Born in Buffalo, New York in 1939, she studied physics at Harvard University, and then in 1961 began graduate studies at MIT, working with Charlie Towns, a Nobel Prize winner famous for his research on masers and lasers. After getting her degree at MIT, she migrates, like so many people, to Southern California and takes a postdoctoral position at Caltech. But perhaps not surprisingly, but unfortunately, Garmire found Caltech at that time to be a very unwelcoming environment for a woman scientist, and she began to explore other potential career paths. As it happened, E.A.T. had a very active local chapter in Los Angeles, and over the next several months after arriving in Pasadena, Garmire became increasingly involved with that chapter. But she also experimented with making art herself. For example, she made a whole series of what she called lasergrams. These were photographs of images made by shining different colored laser light through a variety of reflective and diffractive media. But Garmire also used lasers to create more dynamic, live sort of installation pieces. So this, on the left there, are an example of one of her lasergrams, but on the right is this installation piece that she created in 1969 at Caltech as part of a celebration of the Apollo 11 moon landings. What she did was to take a laser from her laboratory, and again, this was no mean feat. This was not just a simple thing you could pick up and move, but she used the laser from her laboratory to create a light wall, breaking up the light from the krypton and argon lasers into a series of light beams that people could walk through. But at the same time, she had 2 children and a physicist husband at Caltech that she was increasingly estranged from. So, as a member of E.A.T's Los Angeles chapter, Elsa Garmire took a leading role in what became the organization's biggest project. This was a project to build a multimedia pavilion for the Pepsi Soft Drink Corporation that would be exhibited at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan. This was the first international World's Fair to take place in an Asian country, and Pepsi was eager to expand its market base into other countries. So Pepsi hires E.A.T. in 1968, and for the next 2 years, Clover and his artists and technologists worked frantically to design and equip the pavilion for Pepsi. And Garmeyer was one of dozens of artists and engineers who traveled back and forth between the United States and Japan to help build what was arguably the most expensive art project of its era. By the time the collaboration ended, Pepsi had invested somewhere in the order of about $2 million, or about $15 million in today's money, to basically create the art world's version of big science, if you will. So if you were to see the Pepsi Pavilion from the outside, you would notice, for example, it was surrounded by a veil of artificially created fog that would sort of drift and waft over its faceted structure. Or if you were to go inside the pavilion, you might be greeted to a laser bath, a sort of light display that would symbolically cleanse you as you wandered into the interior of the space, where you would encounter a giant hemispherical mirror some 90 feet in diameter that Elsa Garmire had helped design. Its optical properties were such that people and objects on the floor of the room appeared also as if they were floating in space above you. And the dome's acoustics also confounded people's sense of reality as echoes and reverberations added to the visual illusions that people experienced. And the whole goal of the Pepsi Pavilion was to encourage people to have their own experience. If you think about how World's fairs typically operate, you go into a national pavilion and you sort of march your way through it, looking at this thing and that thing, and then you emerge on the other side. The whole idea with the Pepsi Pavilion was that you would go inside and spend time there. You would have your own aesthetic experience. There wasn't anybody telling you what to do, for example. Now, like other big science efforts, building the Pepsi Pavilion was a very interdisciplinary project. It was a confluence of Cold War-derived technologies and artists and engineers and scientists all working together. And as you might have guessed by now, the Pepsi Corporation had a very different vision for this. They were not so much interested in creating a choose-your-own-adventure aesthetic environment. They wanted to sell more sugared water. So at some point, there was a rupture, if you will, between the artists and technologists of E.A.T. and the Pepsi Corporation. But this photo here showing all the different people who contributed in different ways to the Pepsi Pavilion, for me at least, is reminiscent of photographs like this. This is Ernest Lawrence at one of the early cyclotrons at Berkeley, as these people are posing with their machine. So here you have the happy artists and technologists and engineers standing in front of the pavilion. Here, of course, we have one of the paradigmatic examples of big science, if you will. We can think of the pavilion and Ernest Lawrence, of course, again, big machines, big teams, big budgets, all in pursuit of very particular goals. Now, of course, all throughout the 1960s, there were a number of high-profile reports critiquing big science. You know, as science was no longer the realm of the isolated lone genius, if it ever was, in pursuit of truth, but rather science had become the era of big budgets and big teams. And we can see some of the same response to these art and technology efforts in critics' response to these large-scale collaborations between artists and engineers. We can see that there was a diminished enthusiasm by the time we get to the early 1970s for these expensive and large-scale collaborations. Art critics were especially hostile, and they attacked art and technology on three main fronts. First, there was the charge that by collaborating with engineers, artists had somehow compromised themselves aesthetically. By working with lasers and Xerox machines and digital computers and electric lights, and by bringing all of these together into the artist's studio, this was something that both challenged and confounded art critics. Many of them found it hard to differentiate from art versus multimedia discotheques or commercial entertainment. And as I said before, a lot of the artists, quite frankly, just simply didn't understand the technology. Second, there was a lingering ontological question. What exactly was it that artists and engineers were making? Was it artful technology or was it technological art? Throughout the 1960s, critics had a very hard time categorizing what was coming out of these artist and engineer collaborations, and therefore they tended to dismiss it. Museum curators were equally baffled. I mean, what do you do with a laser sculpture? I mean, how do you curate that? I mean, once you turn off the power, what is left? So coupled to this was a disinterest on the part of many of the artists and engineers in making tangible art objects in the first place. For many of them, the whole exciting part, what brought them into the collaboration, was the process of creating and collaborating in the first place. Finally, and most seriously, critics attacked artists for compromising themselves ethically. There were charges that by collaborating with engineers, by using military-derived technology, by accepting corporate patronage, artists had somehow allowed themselves to be diverted from the true path that the artists should follow. Recall that all of this is happening at the same time that the art world was becoming increasingly politicized and activist. Artists were questioning the value and purpose of technology in general. As the sculptor Richard Serra wrote in 1971, technology was, quote, what we do to the Black Panthers and the Vietnamese under the guise of a materialistic theology. It's pretty clear by the time you get to condemnations like that, it's really not about art anymore. The debate had moved on to other levels and other more serious sorts of issues. So I'm often asked, what was the effect of these art and technology collaborations on the individuals that were involved? My response is that we have to look at their individual life trajectories. As I noted, Garmeyer had been interested in using lasers to make art, but her laser artwork caught the attention of a person by the name of Ivan Dreyer, shown here with his back to the photographer. He was a Los Angeles-based filmmaker, and before working in the entertainment business, he had also worked as a guide at Griffith Observatory, so he was also a big fan of astronomy. And he approached Garmeyer with the idea of filming some of the laser images that she produced, but he quickly realized that filming her laser images was aesthetically inferior to seeing the actual intensity and purity of their colors in real time and in person. So Dreyer and Garmeyer co-founded a company in February 1971 called Laser Images Incorporated, and riffing on the popularity of planetarium shows, they called their product Laserium. For the next few years, Dreyer and Garmeyer worked intermittently to perfect their laser show and to stir up interest, and finally in November of 1973, some 700 people showed up at Griffith Observatory to see the debut of Laserium, with classical music and art rock music providing the soundtrack to a display of multicolor laser images projected in real time against the planetarium's starry background. Word of mouth helped expand the audience, and by the time the 4-week engagement at Griffith Observatory ended, hundreds of people were being turned away nightly. This grew into an international company with planetaria and other science, public science venues offering laserium displays all throughout the 1970s up until the early 21st century. So just as planetarium displays had helped popularize astronomy, we can think of laserium as a public display of laser technology, with its roots traceable back to 19th century displays of electricity and electrical effects. It was not without its aesthetic admirers. One art writer, for example, referred to it as having the seeds of what would become the high, universally acclaimed visual art of the future. Of course, given Laserium's penchant for attracting attendees whose appreciation of choreographed laser light was perhaps chemically enhanced, high visual art also takes on a different meaning. Garmeyer, however, returns back to her science career following a divorce and a remarriage, and in this she was quite successful. She achieves a faculty appointment at USC, followed by a position as a professor there, and then eventually moves on to become a dean of engineering at Dartmouth University, elected to the National Academy of Engineering, a whole variety of honoraria shown there. And one of my favorite pictures, an illustration from 2007 showing her reunited with her graduate advisor and mentor, Charlie Towns. When I spoke with her, I asked her, what did she get from her time working with artists? And she said that the biggest thing that she took away from this was a sense of play. She noted that her interactions with artists was something that she brought with her as she mentored her own students, as she encouraged them to experiment, to focus on the creative process, to have some fun, and also to see what would happen, to not go into these experiments with a predetermined sense of what the outcome would be. And this she attributed to her time working with artists, to getting a sense of their creativity, and again, something that she tried to introduce to her students. So to wrap all this up, a couple thoughts. One of them is to question the judgment that critics made in the early 1970s that this art and technology movement was a failure. Now, Billy Klüver had never imagined that E.A.T would have a permanent lifespan. Ultimately, he predicted industry and universities and professional societies would make organizations like E.A.T unnecessary. And while this didn't unfold how he imagined, it did happen. So if you were to walk outside KITP right now, if we were there and you were to walk over to Ealing's Hall and you were to go up a couple flights of stairs, you would find the home of the Media Arts and Technology program. And if you were to look across the entire University of California system, you would see something like 8 or 9 other institutes, departments, or centers, all directed to bringing artists and engineers and scientists together. So again, this is sort of part of the infrastructure that was created. And if we were to expand our scope of vision a little broader, we could find something like 4 or 5 dozen such departments and centers throughout the United States and Europe and South America. So this infrastructure for bringing artists and technologists and scientists together did manage to materialize. The second point to leave you with is I believe that this enthusiasm for art and technology comes in waves. I think there's something important about how these surges of art and technology correlate, for example, with the general state of the economy. I mean, it's not a coincidence that this first enthusiasm for art and technology happens in the 1960s when companies like AT&T and Bell Laboratories and a whole variety of aerospace companies are exceptionally profitable, and they can afford to support and encourage these art and technology collaborations. But it's also tied to concerns about higher education. Again, this continuing cycle of being concerned about how to humanize technologists, about how to introduce them to the societal and ethical implications of their work by exposing them to the humanities and the visual arts is a recurring pattern that we see over and over in this history. But what I really want to emphasize is how these histories from the 1960s, the 1980s, and today remind us that art and technology and artists and engineers are not static categories. Rather, they are evolving communities and they are evolving cultural enterprises. And what art and science and art and technology together have in common with each other is their capacity to show us something new, to surprise us. Again, that's sort of my working definition of what good art is. I should learn something new, I should be surprised, I should see something new. And as we look at these successive waves of enthusiasm for art and technology, we see these shifting relationships between artists and engineers and corporations and various publics in the art world itself. And ultimately, this is about how engineers as well as artists presented their expertise, displayed their creativity. One way they did this was by wiring and rewiring both the art world as well as works of art together to make art work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. That's fascinating.